In the chaos of World War I, where machine guns and trenches ruled, the cavalry didn't just survive. They adapted, charging through history with sabers drawn and horses thundering. This is the untold story of their grit, glory, and unexpected triumph on a battlefield that tried to leave them behind. In the mud and blood of World War I, cavalry didn't die. It evolved. This is the untold story of horses and heroes on the modern battlefield. Popular movies and TV shows would have you believe that cavalry soldiers in World War I were nothing but tragic fools galloping headlong into machine. Gunfire destined for slaughter. The image of horsemen charging straight into modern weapons seems so ridiculous that most people assume cavalry units were obsolete the moment the first shot was fired. But here's the shocking truth. Cavalry wasn't just surviving on the Western Front. In many ways, it was thriving. Those beautiful horses and skilled riders weren't the outdated relics you've been led to believe. They were elite troops with centuries of tradition who adapted to the deadliest battlefield humanity had ever created. What's even more surprising, while thousands did indeed die, cavalry soldiers actually had better survival odds than many infantry units trapped in the meat grinder of trench warfare. All right, let's head back to 1914. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously, adjust those pillows. Pull up that blanket because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. So, congratulations. You just woke up in a cavalry camp in Belgium, August 1914. The sun hasn't quite risen yet, but the eastern sky is turning that peculiar shade of gray-pink that promises another hot summer day. Your eyes crack open to the sound of soft nickering from hundreds of horses. The earthy smell of hay and horse manure fills your nostrils, not unpleasant, but rich and organic. Nothing like your clean bedroom. Now, your back aches slightly from sleeping on the ground with just a thin wool blanket between you and the earth. Unlike the infantry with their heavier packs, cavalry traveled light. A proper bed. That's a luxury you haven't seen in weeks. Your uniform is wrinkled from being slept in, and the leather of your boots has stiffened overnight. Around you, other men are stirring, some already up and seeing to their horses. You stretch, feeling the weight of responsibility. Even before you're fully awake, the infantry soldier had to care for himself and his rifle. You have to care for yourself, your weapons, and a 1,000 pounds animal that depends entirely on you before you can even think about breakfast. There's your horse to check on. Walking over to the picket line where the horses are tethered, you approach your mount, a sturdy bay gelding with a white blaze down his face. He recognizes you immediately, ears perking forward in greeting. Unlike the mechanical weapons of this new industrial war, your primary vehicle knows you, trusts you, and forms a bond with you that will mean life or death. For both of you, Morning Brigadier, you murmur, running your hand along his neck. The horse's coat is warm under your fingers, his breathing steady. You quickly check his legs for any swelling or heat that might indicate injury. All clear. Next, you inspect his hooves using a small pick to clear out any stones or debris. A cavalry horse with bad feet is worse than useless. It's a liability that could get you both killed. All around the camp, the same morning ritual is playing out. 500 men caring for 500 horses. The 4th Royal Irish Dragoon Guards, one of Britain's oldest and most prestigious cavalry regiments, preparing for what might be the first day of combat against the Germans. There's a certain tranquility to these morning moments that belies the danger come, the soft sounds of horses, the quiet conversations between men, the smell of coffee brewing at the field kitchen. These rhythms of cavalry life haven't changed much in centuries. Your grandfather would recognize this scene from his military service. So would his grandfather. But what lies ahead would be like nothing any cavalryman had ever faced before. After, seeing to your horse, you head to the field kitchen for breakfast. Army food isn't gourmet, but the cavalry tends to eat better than the infantry. Being mobile means better access to fresh supplies. This morning it's hot. Porridge, bacon, bread, and strong tea. Fuel for the day ahead. The tea scalds. Your tongue slightly, but you drink it anyway, savoring the warmth and caffeine. The men around you are a mix of excitement and nervousness. Many are career soldiers who've served in colonial campaigns in Africa or India. They've seen combat before, but never against a European power with modern weapons. The younger recruits' boys really try to mirror the calm demeanor of the veterans, but their bouncing legs and darting eyes give them away. Your squadron leader, Captain Harrison, approaches with a map tucked under his arm. He's a weathered man in his 40s, with a magnificent mustache that seems to be standard issue for cavalry officers. We're moving out in an hour. He announces, intelligence reports German cavalry patrols 10 miles east. Headquarters wants us to make contact, assess their strength, and report back. No unnecessary engagements. A reconnaissance mission perfect for cavalry. Despite what you might think, the primary role of cavalry in 1914 wasn't charging headlong into enemy lines. It was scouting, screening, and reconnaissance, using the mobility of horses to gather intelligence and protect the flanks of the advancing army. After breakfast, you return to Brigadier to prepare him for the day's ride. First, you brush him thoroughly, checking again for any sores or issues that might cause problems later. Then comes the saddle blanket, positioned carefully to prevent rubbing. The McClellan saddle goes on next. Not particularly comfortable for rider or horse, but practical for long days of riding. You secure the girth, making sure it's tight enough to hold the saddle in place, but not so tight it restricts breathing. Your kit is minimal but essential. Attached to your saddle are saddlebags containing spare ammunition, rations, a grooming kit for your horse, and a few personal items. Your water bottle hangs from one side, balanced by a feed bag on the other. Your greatcoat is rolled tightly and strapped behind the saddle. A cavalry trooper travels light. Everything you need must be carried by your horse, and an overburdened horse is a slow horse. The most noticeable difference between you and infantry soldiers is your weapons. While you carry a Lee Enfield rifle like they do, yours is specially designed for cavalry, slightly shorter for easier handling on horseback. It's secured in a leather scabbard attached to your saddle. You also wear a sword, the 1908 pattern. Cavalry sword, straight-bladed and designed for thrusting rather than slashing. Some men in your regiment scoff at the sword as outdated, but others swear by it, especially in close quarters, fighting where a rifle might be too unwieldy. By 7 o'clock, the entire regiment is mounted and ready to move out. 500 men on 500 horses, arranged in perfect formation. The early morning sun glints off polished brass buttons and the metal scabbards of swords. It's an impressive sight, one that's changed little since Napoleon's time. As you ride out of camp, you can't help but feel a surge of pride. This is what you train for. This is what the cavalry is meant to do. Move swiftly, gather information, engage the enemy when necessary, and use the mobility of horses to outmaneuver and outthink the opposition. The countryside of Belgium in August 1914 is beautiful. Rolling green fields, small woods, quaint villages with church spires rising above red-tiled roofs. Farmers pause in their work to watch your regiment pass, some waving, others looking concerned. The war has barely touched this landscape yet. That will change soon enough. Your squadron spreads out as you advance, maintaining visual contact but covering more ground. You ride at the front of a four-man section, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. Brigadier moves with an easy rhythm beneath you, his hooves making a soft thudding sound on the dirt road. The weight of your equipment, the creak of leather the jingle of metal. These sounds have accompanied cavalry for centuries. Around midday, your squadron stops in a small copse of trees to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of bread, cheese, and dried meat. The horses graze on the lush grass while the men talk in low voices, discussing what might lie ahead. Captain Harrison consults his map again, conferring with the senior NCOs about the route forward. Germans are likely advancing through that valley, he says, pointing to a feature on the map. We'll approach from a high ground here, observe their numbers, and then withdraw to report. It sounds straightforward enough, but war is rarely straightforward. As your squadron crests a gentle hill 2 hours later, you see them gray uniformed figures on horseback in the distance. German cavalry, perhaps 30 riders moving perpendicular to your position, unaware of your presence. Captain Harrison signals the squadron to halt and dismount. Binoculars come out as the officers assess the situation. You remain mounted with 3 other men ready to ride back, with messages if needed. Ulan, mutters the sergeant beside you, referring to the German lancers. See the pennants on their lances. You nod, studying the enemy through your own field glasses. The German cavalrymen look much like you, men on horses doing their job. It's strange to think that in a few minutes you might be trying to kill each other. The Germans suddenly halt. One of their riders points in your direction. They've spotted you. Mount up, Captain Harrison shouts. We've been seen. There's a momentary scramble as men return to their horses. The Germans are now moving directly toward your position, picking up speed. We'll withdraw to that tree line and set up a firing position. Harrison orders. No need for a direct engagement if we can avoid it. This is where cavalry training shows its worth. Within seconds, all 50 men of your squadron are mounted and moving at a trot toward the designated position. The Germans are still coming now at a gallop, clearly hoping to force an engagement. You reach the tree line, and the order comes to dismount. 1 man in 4 is designated as a horse holder, taking the reins of 4 horses and leading them to safety behind the trees. The rest of you deploy in a skirmish. Line, rifles at the ready. The Germans, seeing your prepared position, slow their approach. They're now about 800 yards away, apparently reassessing their options. A standoff ensues. Then, without warning, 3 riders break away from the German formation and ride forward at a gallop. Captain Harrison raises his binoculars again. They're sending officers a parley, he says with surprise. Sergeant Major, have the men hold their fire. The 3 German officers approach to within 100 yards. Before halting, one of them calls out in accented but clear English. British cavalry, we have orders to avoid unnecessary conflict. We are withdrawing to our lines. Captain Harrison steps forward. We have similar orders, sir. Safe passage to you. The German officer salutes. Harrison returns it, and the 3 Germans wheel their horses around and ride back to their unit. Within minutes, the entire German squadron has disappeared back over the horizon. It's an unexpectedly civilized encounter, a remnant of the old rules of warfare that would soon be washed away in the blood and mud of the Western Front. For now, though, there's a certain chivalry between opposing cavalry units, professional respect between men who understand the challenges and skills of mounted warfare. Well, that was disappointingly polite. Jokes on the troopers as you remount. Plenty of time for killing later, replies the sergeant. Let's get back and report what we've seen. As your squadron rides back toward the main British force, you reflect on this strange first encounter with the enemy. No shots fired, no charges, no heroics, just 2 groups of mounted scouts doing their job and choosing not to engage unnecessarily. Is this what war is like? You would soon find out how wrong that impression was. The next morning, August 22nd, 1914, your regiment is on the move again, this time with a more direct purpose. Intelligence reports indicate significant German forces moving through a nearby village, and your regiment has been ordered to investigate, and if possible, delay their advance. Dawn breaks misty and cool as the 4th Dragoon Guards moves out. There's a tension in the air now, a sense that the day will not end with polite exchanges and mutual withdrawals. The men are quieter, checking and rechecking their weapons. Officers speak in hushed tones, studying maps and conferring about approach routes. As the sun burns away, the morning mist, your regiment approaches the village of Casto. The plan is simple. Advance to the village. Outskirts. Assess enemy strength and act accordingly. If the German presence is limited, you might engage. If it's substantial, you'll withdraw and report. Rounding a bend in the road, your advance party suddenly halts. There, not 300 yards ahead, is a German patrol, about 20 Ulan moving slowly down the road. Towards you, neither side was expecting the other, and for a brief moment, there's a frozen tableau of surprise. Captain Hornby, leading the advance party, doesn't hesitate. His sword flashes out its scabbard as he shouts, "Charge!" And just like that, you're experiencing something that has happened countless times in military history, but would soon become increasingly rare. A cavalry charge against cavalry. The Germans recover quickly from their surprise and level their lances. The two groups of horsemen thunder toward each other, a scene that could have been plucked from any war of the previous few centuries. The ground shakes beneath pounding hooves. Men shout, horses snort and strain. The impact is chaotic and violent. The momentum of galloping horses combines with the skill and strength of trained cavalrymen wielding swords against lances. You find yourself face to face with a German trooper, his lance point aimed at your chest. You swerve Brigadier at the last second, the lance tip tearing through your uniform sleeve but missing flesh. Swinging your sword, you catch the German across the shoulder, unseating him. There's no time to see what happens to him as you're immediately engaged with another opponent. The melee lasts only minutes, but it feels like hours. A whirlwind of flashing metal, straining horses, and shouted commands. When it's over, the Germans are retreating, leaving several dead and wounded behind. Your regiment has suffered casualties. 2, 3 men dead, 7 wounded, and 5 horses lost. But you won the engagement. What you don't realize in that moment is that you've just participated in history. Captain Hornby has become the first British soldier to kill a German in the war using a sword in that initial charge. And Corporal Edward Thomas of your regiment has fired the first British shot of the war during the skirmish. The First World War has begun in earnest for the British Expeditionary Force, and cavalry led the way. But this small victory is just a prelude. As your regiment regroups and tends to the wounded, dispatch riders bring news. Massive German forces are advancing all along the front. The British Army is deploying along the Mons Canal, preparing for what will be the first major battle of the war for British forces. By nightfall, your regiment has withdrawn to support positions behind the infantry lines at Mons. The distant rumble of artillery can be heard as both sides prepare for tomorrow's battle. Men care for their horses, clean their weapons, and write letters home, some of which will be their last. You sit beside Brigadier, running a cloth along your sword to clean the blood from it. The events of the day replay in your mind. The charge, the clash, the retreat of the Germans. It had been everything cavalry training had prepared you for, but rumor has it that the Germans have machine guns and artillery in numbers you've never faced before. How will horses and swords fare against such weapons? As darkness falls completely, you try to get some sleep, using your saddle as a pillow. Tomorrow will bring the Battle of Mons, the first major test for British forces and for cavalry on the modern battlefield. The clash between traditional warfare and industrial killing machines is about to reach its bloody climax. Sleep comes fitfully as distant gunfire, and the soft breathing of hundreds of horses provides a soundtrack to your dreams. In those dreams, you're charging, again and again, but the enemy keeps changing. Sometimes German lancers, sometimes faceless men behind machine guns, sometimes strange mechanical beasts that spit fire and metal. You wake several times a night, reaching out to check that brigadier is still there beside you. The solid warmth of the horse is reassuring, a living link to centuries of warfare that's about to be transformed forever. What place will cavalry have in the world that's coming? Will the skills you've spent years perfecting still matter on the battlefield of tomorrow? Dawn will bring answers, but not the ones anyone expects. The Battle of Mons had been a sobering experience for everyone. While the British infantry had performed admirably against superior German numbers, the reality of modern firepower had become brutally clear. The carefully spaced trenches were just the beginning of what would eventually stretch into a 400-mile network of earthworks from Switzerland to the North Sea. Major William Harrington stood at the edge of the cavalry encampment, watching his men tend to their horses in the fading November light. 3 months into the war, and everything was changing. The swift mobile warfare everyone had expected was congealing into something static and alien. "Beautiful animals, aren't they, sir?" said Captain James Reynolds, approaching from behind. "Indeed." Harrington nodded, his breath visible in the chill air. "Though I sometimes wonder if they know what they gotten themselves into." Reynolds laughed softly. More than most of the men did, I'd wager. Harrington was an officer of the old school, Eton-educated from a family with a long military tradition. His grandfather had ridden with the Light Brigade at Balaclava, surviving that infamous charge. Now, 60 years later, Harrington commanded a squadron of the 5th Dragoon Guards, wondering if cavalry still had a place in this new kind of war. "I've just come from division," Reynolds said, his tone shifting to business. "New orders. We're to move 5 miles north tomorrow. Establish a reserve position behind the 2nd Infantry Brigade." Still playing. "Fireman, then," Harrington sighed. The fireman nickname had stuck to the cavalry in recent weeks. With the front lines now largely static, cavalry units were being held in reserve, ready to rush to any section where the enemy might break through, like a fire brigade, responding to alarms. "It's not the role we trained for," Reynolds acknowledged, "but it's important work. The men are adapting well." Harrington nodded again, watching as a young trooper methodically checked his horse's hooves. "They are better than I expected." The encampment bustled with the evening rituals of cavalry life. Unlike the infantry, crammed into muddy trenches, the mounted units were typically billeted behind the lines in villages, farms, or purpose-built camps. This afforded them certain comforts, but also meant they were constantly on the move, rarely staying in one place more than a few days. Tonight, they were housed in the stables and outbuildings of a large French farm. The horses had shelter, crucial as winter approached, and the men had taken over the barn, loft, and a couple of outbuildings. The farmhouse itself served as officers' quarters and headquarters. "We should prepare the men for a long winter," Harrington said after a moment. "Supply officer tells me the winter kit is finally coming through. Heavier blankets for the horses, winter greatcoats for the men." "Not a moment too soon," Reynolds replied. "That rain last night was nearly ice." As if to punctuate his point, a cold gust of wind swept across the farmyard, causing men to hunch their shoulders and horses to shift uneasily. Winter in northern France could be brutal, not the killing cold of Russia, but a damp, penetrating chill that seemed to seep into bones and lungs. "Have the veterinary officer check every horse before we move out tomorrow," Harrington ordered. "I won't lose. Animals' preventable issues. And make sure the farriers have adequate supplies. Roads will only get worse from here." "Yes, sir." As Reynolds departed to relay the orders, Harrington continued his evening inspection. The 5th Dragoons prided themselves on horse management. Even now, with the nature of their deployment changing weekly, the regiment maintained rigorous standards of horse care. Each animal received a daily ration of 14 pounds of oats and 14 pounds of hay. When supplies permitted, they were groomed twice daily, their hooves checked after every movement, and their tack kept in immaculate condition. A cavalry regiment without healthy horses was useless, and everyone from the greenest trooper to the colonel understood this fundamental truth. The distinctive smell of the horse lines, a mixture of hay, manure, leather, and oil metal, was oddly comforting to Harrington. It smelled a tradition of centuries of mounted warfare. His father had commanded cavalry in India, his grandfather in the Crimea. Now he led men in what was supposedly the war to end all wars, wondering if he commanded the last generation of horse soldiers. Inside the main stable, Harrington found Sergeant Major Blackwood supervising the evening feed, a career soldier with 20 years' service. Blackwood knew every horse in the squadron personally, often spotting potential problems before even the veterinary officers. "Evening, sir," Blackwood said, saluting. "Just finishing up here." "Carry on, Sergeant." "Major, any issues I should know about?" Blackwood stroked his impressive mustache thoughtfully. "Nothing serious, sir. 3 horses with minor saddle sores being treated, one with a slight cough under observation. Otherwise, all fit for tomorrow's move." "Good. And the men?" "Morale is solid, sir. They're glad to be out of that rain. Those from the younger lads are itching for more action." Harrington smiled wryly. "They may get their wish sooner than they expect. Rumors have been circulating about a major offensive in the spring. For now, though, the Western Front was settling into its winter routine. Artillery exchanges, small raids, and the constant grinding attrition of trench warfare. After completing his inspection, Harrington returned to a farmhouse where the officers had established their mess. The room was warm, heated by a cast-iron stove in the corner. Maps covered the large oak table, cups of steaming tea and brandy sniffers scattered among them. "Ah, William." Colonel Lyford greeted him just in time. "We're discussing tomorrow's disposition." For the next hour, they pored over maps, planning the regiment's movement, and potential responses to various scenarios. The cavalry's new role required different tactical thinking, less about sweeping maneuvers and more about rapid response, knowing which routes could accommodate mounted troops quickly, which bridges could support their weight, which villages offered suitable temporary quarters. Intelligence suggests increased enemy activity here, and here, the intelligence officers said, pointing to sections of the line, if they're planning a push before winter fully sets in, these would be the likely points. Harrington studied the map. The road network favors us in the northern sector. We could have a squadron there within 40 minutes of an alarm. Precisely why we're positioning. There, Lyford nodded. The infantry commanders sleep better knowing we're close at hand. The meeting concluded, and the officers dispersed to their various duties. Harrington stepped outside for a moment, lighting his pipe, and gazing up at the stars now visible in the clearing sky. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Tomorrow would dawn with frost. A sudden commotion from the horse lines drew his attention. Shouts, the distinctive sound of a horse in distress. Harrington moved quickly, pipe still clenched between his teeth. He found several troopers attempting to calm a large gray gelding that was rearing and snorting eyes wild in the lantern light. "What's happening here?" he demanded. "It's thunder, sir." "Eh?" Young trooper explained. Something spooked him bad, nearly kicked through the stall. Sergeant Major Blackwood appeared, taking in the situation at a glance. "Easy now, lads. Give him space." The sergeant major approached the agitated horse slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. Gradually, the animal settled, though it continued to tremble and roll its eyes. "Probably an owl or fox," Blackwood said, running experienced. Hands over the horse, checking for injuries. "He's a nervous one, this one, but a damn fine charger when he settles." Harrington watched with admiration. Blackwood had a way with horses that couldn't be taught, an instinctive understanding born of years of experience. Men like him were the backbone of any cavalry regiment. "No harm done, sir," Blackwood reported. "I'll have one of the lads sit with him for a bit." "Very good, Sergeant Major." As Harrington turned to leave, his foot crunched on something in the straw. Reaching down, he picked up a spent signal flare casing. Understanding dawned immediately. "Artillery practice," he said, holding up the casing. The guns to the north. The flash and noise would have been visible. From here, the horses, like the men, were adapting to war, but artillery, with its blinding flashes and ear-shattering concussions, remained particularly terrifying to the animals. It was one of the many challenges of maintaining cavalry in this new age of industrial warfare. Back in his quarters, Harrington wrote in his journal by lamplight, a nightly ritual since the war began. He documented the day's events, the regiment's status, his observations and concerns. Historians of future wars might find such accounts valuable, he thought, though he doubted those future conflicts would include horses. The next morning dawned bitterly cold, the farmyard crisp with frost. Breath from men and horses hung in the air like smoke as the regiment prepared to move. Out! Saddles were checked, girths tightened, weapons inspected. By 8 o'clock, they were mounted and ready. Harrington rode at the head of his squadron, the massive chestnut stallion, beneath him moving with powerful strides despite the cold. Caesar was his third mount of the war, the first lost enemy fired during the retreat from Mons, the second to Colic in October. Such losses were part of cavalry life, though each one hurt. A good officer cared for his men, but he loved his horses. The regiment moved north at a steady trot, hooves clattering on the frozen road. To their left, the distant thunder of artillery provided a constant backdrop. The drums of the war, as the men called it. Occasionally a mounted dispatch rider would pass them, hurrying, messages from headquarters to the front or back again. By midday, they had reached their new position, a small village about 3 miles behind the front line. The place was already a hive of military activity with infantry support units, field kitchens, and a dressing station for the wounded. The arrival of 500 mounted troops added to the controlled chaos. Sergeant Major Blackwood efficiently organized the horse lines in what had once been the village green. Picket lines were established, feed and water arranged, shelter improvised where possible. The horses would be vulnerable to artillery here. German guns occasionally reached this far behind the lines, but there was no better option. "We'll rotate shelter for the animals," Harrington instructed, for hours on the lines. Priority to those showing signs of cold stress. The village had been largely abandoned by its civilian population, though a few stubborn residents remained, mostly elderly people unwilling to leave their homes. The local priest had stayed as, well, turning his church into a combination shelter, hospital, and community center. Harrington established his squadron headquarters in what had been the village school. The children's desks had been pushed against the walls, replaced by maps, field telephones, and the other paraphernalia of modern warfare. Telephone connection, too. Division established, sir," reported Lieutenant Parker, the signals officer. "They want an acknowledgement of our arrival and readiness status. Inform them we're settled and operational." Harrington replied, "Request update on enemy activity in our sector." The response came back quickly. No significant changes. Routine artillery. Exchanges continuing. No infantry action expected in the immediate future. So, began another day of waiting. The strange new rhythm of cavalry warfare. They would remain here caring for their horses, maintaining their equipment, running drills and exercises. Always ready to respond at a moment's notice if the line was threatened. This waiting was perhaps the hardest adjustment for cavalry officers and men alike. Their training and traditions centered on movement, on taking the initiative. Now they were essentially a mobile reserve, their value measured not in charges or reconnaissance, but in their ability to rush to threatened points of the line. Late that afternoon, Harrington led a small party of officers on a reconnaissance of the local area. They needed to familiarize themselves with every road, track, and potential cross-country route that might be used in an emergency. They rode first to a small rise that offered a view of the front lines in the distance. Through field glasses, Harrington could make out the zigzag pattern of trenches, the occasional flash of artillery, the drifting smoke that never quite seemed to clear. "Hard to believe it's been only 3 months," said Captain Reynolds, scanning the scene beside him. "Looks like they've been digging in for years." Harrington lowered his glasses. "This is just the beginning, James. If neither side can break through, this line could remain for the duration." "Surely not, sir." "The spring offensives." Perhaps, Harrington said, unconvinced, "but those trenches get deeper and more elaborate by the day. The Germans aren't planning to leave any time soon, and neither are we." They continued their reconnaissance, noting potential routes on their maps, identifying obstacles, marking areas where the ground might become impossible in heavy rain. It was meticulous, necessary work, lacking the glamour of cavalry charges, but potentially far more important to their actual role. As they rode back to the village in the gathering dusk, they passed a column of infantry trudging toward the front lines, replacements for units that had suffered heavy casualties. The men looked young and apprehensive, their faces smudged with road dust, their boots caked with mud despite the frost. One young soldier looked up at the passing cavalry officers with something like envy in his eyes. From his perspective, they must have seemed privileged, mounted while he walked, clean while he was filthy, headed away from danger while he moved toward it. If only he knew, Harrington thought, the cavalry's casualties had been lighter so far. True, but they faced their own dangers and hardships. And when the big pushes came as they inevitably would, mounted troops would be just as exposed to machine guns and artillery as anyone else. Back in the village, Harrington found a flurry of activity. A dispatch rider had arrived with news. German forces had launched a limited attack about 10 miles south, and while the line was holding, reinforcements were being sent as a precaution. "Are we needed, sir?" asked the regimental sergeant major, already preparing to issue orders. "Not yet," Harrington replied, reading the dispatch. "They want us alert but in position. The 7th Cavalry Brigade is responding." Throughout the evening, reports trickled in. The German attack had been repulsed, with heavy losses on both sides. By midnight, the situation was declared stable, and the regiment stood down from its heightened readiness, though normal watches continued. In his makeshift quarters in what had been the schoolmaster's office, Harrington tried to sleep. The cot was narrow and hard, the room cold despite a small stove in the corner. Through the thin walls, he could hear the sounds of the village at night, sentries calling to each other, horses shifting in there, temporary stables, the distant rumble of guns that never fully ceased. His mind drifted to the weeks ahead. Winter was barely beginning, and already conditions were difficult. How would they maintain the horses through the coldest months? Would supply lines hold? Would disease sweep through the closely quartered animals as it had in wars past? And beyond the immediate concerns, larger questions loomed. What was the future of cavalry in this new kind of warfare? Were they witnessing the end of an era, the last campaign, where horses would play a significant role? As sleep finally claimed him, Harrington's last thought was his grandfather's stories of the charge of the Light Brigade, horsemen riding valiantly into the mouth of cannon. Perhaps things hadn't changed as much as he feared. They were still sending cavalry against artillery, just more cautiously, more strategically. The question remained whether the outcome would be any different. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the village and the horse lines with white. The animals shifted and snorted, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold night air. Sentries pulled their great coats tighter, watching the darkness beyond. The village, and a few miles away, men huddled in trenches, envying the cavalry their relative comfort, while the cavalry envied the infantry their clarity of purpose. The war was transforming, becoming something no one had anticipated. For the horsemen of the 5th Dragoon Guards, like cavalry units all along the Western Front, the challenge was clear: adapt or become obsolete. The days of glorious charges might be passing, but as long as there was ground to cover quickly, information to gather, and weak points to reinforce, there would be a place for horses and the men who rode them in the strange new world of industrialized slaughter. The winter of 1915-1916 proved to be one of the harshest in memory. Sergeant Thomas Miller had seen 3 winters in the Army before the war, but nothing compared to what the cavalry endured in northern France. By January, the regiment had established semi-permanent winter quarters in a cluster of villages about 10 miles behind the front lines. The once grand stables of A. French Count's estate now housed 200 horses, while others were distributed among barns and makeshift shelters throughout the area. Miller woke before dawn, as he did every day. 2 years into the war, his body had adjusted to the rhythm of cavalry life in the field. Sleep when you can, eat when you can. Always care for your horse first. The stable was warmer than outside, though not by much. The collective body heat of the horses raised the temperature just enough to keep water from freezing solid. "Oh, morning, Jupiter," he murmured to the big bay gelding that had been his mount for the past 14 months. The horse nickered softly in recognition, warm breath visible in the cold air. Miller had joined the Army in 1911 as a young man seeking adventure and a steady wage. Now at 27, he was a veteran non-commissioned officer with the responsibility of 16 men and their horses. The adventure had faded, replaced by routine duty and an intimate knowledge of everything that could go wrong with cavalry operations in modern war. The morning routine never varied. First, check the horse, feet, legs, body, looking for any signs of injury, illness, or discomfort. Jupiter seemed fine this morning despite the cold. Next, mucking out the stall, laying fresh straw, then grooming curry-comb body, brush mane and tail combed, eyes and nostrils cleaned. Other men moved through the same rituals nearby, the stable filled with the soft sounds of horses and quiet conversation. Despite the monotony, there was comfort in these daily tasks, a connection to normality in a world gone mad. Sergeant Miller called a voice from the stable entrance. "Captain wants to see all NCOs at headquarters half an hour." Acknowledged, Miller replied, continuing his work. Whatever the captain wanted could wait until Jupiter was properly tended. By the time Miller had finished grooming, watering, and providing Jupiter's morning feed, the stable was fully awake. Troopers moved efficiently through their tasks. the more experienced men helping the newer replacements. The regiment had received several dozen new men in December. Younger recruits with minimal training rushed to the front to replace casualties. Keep an eye on Parsons. Miller instructed Corporal Jenkins before leaving. He's still using too much pressure with the currycomb. Outside, the winter morning was bitterly cold, but clear. Frost covered everything, glittering in the early light. Miller's breath formed clouds as he walked through the village toward the stone farmhouse that served as squadron headquarters. Other sergeants and corporals were already gathering in what had once been the farmhouse kitchen. A large map of the sector hung on one wall marked with colored pins indicating troop positions, supply routes, and points of interest. Captain Edwards entered, accompanied by the squadron's lieutenant. "Gentlemen," Edwards began without preamble, "we have new orders. Division is rotating regiments for frontline duty. We're moving up tomorrow for a 2-week deployment." A subtle shift in the room. Not quite tension, but a refocusing of attention. Frontline duty for cavalrymen. Dismounted operations functioning essentially as infantry in the trenches. It wasn't what they had trained for, but it had become a regular part of cavalry life as the war settled into its grinding pattern. Troop sergeants, you'll oversee preparation of equipment today. 1/4 of our strength will remain here with the horses. Roster to be determined this afternoon. The rest of us move out. At 0500 tomorrow, the briefing continued with specific assignments, sector, information, and the latest intelligence on enemy activity. Miller listened carefully, mentally preparing lists of what his men would need, who should stay with the horses, who would be most effective in trench conditions. When the meeting concluded, Miller returned to the stables to begin preparations. This would be the regiment's 3rd rotation to the front line since autumn. The first had been chaotic. Cavalrymen unaccustomed to trench warfare, unsure of their role. The second had gone more smoothly. This time they knew what to expect. "Frontline duty, lads," he announced to his troop, "pack your gear today. We move out tomorrow morning." The men received the news with typical stoicism. No one joined the cavalry expecting to fight in trenches, but adaptability had become the watchword of this war. "What about the horses?" Sergeant asked Young. "Trooper Parsons," his face concerned. "Skeleton crew stays behind," Miller replied. "Roster will be posted this afternoon. Now get to work." Full equipment check. Clean your rifles. Pack only what's on the list. Throughout the day, the village hummed with activity. Equipment was checked, cleaned, and prepared. Rifles, the short Lee-Enfield carbines issued to cavalry, were given special attention. In the trenches, a fouled rifle could mean death. Extra ammunition was distributed along with hand grenades, wire cutters, and the other tools of trench warfare. By evening, everything was ready. Miller made his final rounds, checking his men's preparations and ensuring those selected to remain with the horses understood their responsibilities. "Remember," he told Private Wilson, who would be in charge of Jupiter and 3 other horses, "daily exercise is essential, weather permitting. If you can't ride, at least walk them and check Jupiter's right. Front hoof daily. It was showing signs of thrush last week." Wilson nodded. Seriously, at 19, he was one of the younger troopers, but he had a natural way with horses. "I'll care for them like they were my own, Sergeant." After completing his duties, Miller found himself with a rare hour of free time before sleep. The village had a small estaminet that was still operating despite the war, or perhaps because of it. Military authorities allowed it to remain open, recognizing the men's need for some semblance of normal life. The place was crowded with soldiers, the air thick with tobacco smoke and conversation. Miller found a seat at a table with several other NCOs from his squadron. "Another stint in the mud, then," said Sergeant Parker, pushing a glass of rough red wine toward Miller. "Just what I joined the cavalry for." There was a rumble of sardonic laughter. This had become a running joke among cavalry NCOs. The disparity between what they had trained for and what they now did could be worse, Miller replied, sipping the wine. At least we get rotated out. Infantry, poor bastards, stay in those trenches for months. True. Enough, Parker acknowledged. And word is there's a big push coming in spring. Cavalry might actually be used properly. For once, Miller had heard these rumors before, since the front had stabilized. In late 1914, there had been constant talk of breakthrough offensives that would return the war to movement, allowing cavalry to fulfill its traditional role. So far, none had materialized. The defense, trenches, machine guns, artillery consistently proved stronger than the offense. I'll believe it when I see it, he said. Meanwhile, we'd best get some sleep. Early start tomorrow. Morning came too. Soon, the village stirring while stars still shone in the black sky. Temperatures had dropped further overnight, and equipment froze to the touch. Men stamped their feet and blew. On their hands as they assembled, Miller made a final visit to Jupiter before departing. The horse seemed to sense something was happening. Ears pricked forward attentively. Look after yourself. Oh boy, Miller said, stroking the animal's neck. I'll be back before you know it. There was something particularly difficult about leaving the horses behind. For cavalrymen, their mounts were more than just transport. They were partners, companions in the strange world of war. Walking away to fight on foot felt wrong somehow, as if they were abandoning a fundamental part of their identity. The regiment moved out in pre-dawn darkness, marching. Rather than riding toward the front lines, each man carried his rifle, ammunition, grenades, and personal kit. The familiar weight of sabers was absent. Those remained behind, useless. In trench warfare, as they marched, the sound of artillery grew louder. The front was never truly quiet, but the morning usually brought an increase in shelling as both sides began their daily harassment of enemy positions. By mid-morning, they had reached the reserve trenches where they would spend their first day acclimating before moving to the front line proper. The trenches were a maze of muddy passages, reinforced with wooden boards, sandbags, and corrugated iron, dugouts carved into. The trench walls provided some shelter, though most were damp and cramped. Miller organized his men in their assigned section, ensuring they understood the layout, the communication trenches leading forward, the latrine. Locations, the nearest medical post. Veterans helped newcomers adjust, explaining the unwritten rules of trench life, where to walk to avoid sniper, fire, how to tell from the sound if an incoming shell would land close, when to wear gas masks. It's different from what you're used to, Miller told his troop, but the basics are the same. Stay alert, follow orders, look after your equipment and each other. We've done this before, and we'll do it again. That night, they moved up to the front line trenches, replacing infantry who had been there for weeks. The handover was quick and businesslike. Information passed about enemy positions, recent activity, trouble spots in the line. Careful at the junction with the communication trench. An exhausted infantry sergeant told Miller, German, sniper has been active there. Already got 2 of our lads. The next 2 weeks fell into the strange rhythm of trench warfare. Each day blended into the next, marked by regular routines. Stand to at dawn and dusk when enemy attacks were. Most likely sentry duty, maintenance work on the trenches, occasional patrols. Into no man's land under cover of darkness. Rain made everything worse, turning the trench floor to sticky mud that sucked at boots and made movement exhausting. Water seeped through clothing, causing the misery of trench foot that could lead to amputation if not treated. The men did what they could, changing socks when possible, massaging circulation back into cold feet, applying whale oil when it was available. On their 5th day in a line, The Germans launched a gas attack. The warning came just in. Time, a century, spotting the telltale yellow-green cloud drifting across no man's land. The alarm rattle, sounding along the trench. Gas, gas, the cry went up as men scrambled to don their masks. Miller helped a panicking young trooper secure his mask properly, then checked his own. The respirators were effective, but claustrophobic, reducing vision and making communication difficult. Through the eyepieces, the world took on a distorted, nightmarish quality. The gas cloud enveloped their position, lingering for hours before winds finally dispersed it. Two men in another section hadn't secured their masks properly and were evacuated with blistered lungs and streaming eyes. They would likely survive, but might never regain full respiratory function. Different from a cavalry charge, ain't it? Wheezed Corporal Jenkins once they could remove their masks. His attempt at humor fell flat in the aftermath of the attack, but Miller appreciated the effort. Not what we signed up for, he agreed, but it's what we've got. That night, a runner brought news from the rear. A dispatch rider had reported that several horses had fallen ill with a respiratory infection, possibly influenza. Jupiter was not among them, but the news added another layer of worry to Miller's already burdened mind. The remainder of their rotation passed without major incident. Daily artillery exchanges, occasional sniper fire, the constant work of maintaining the trench system. 3 men from the regiment were wounded by shell fragments. 1, seriously enough to be evacuated to England. On their final night in the line, Miller led a small patrol into no man's land to inspect the German wire defenses. It was dangerous work, crawling through mud and shell holes, always at risk of flares illuminating the position, or machine guns opening fire if they were spotted. They moved silently in the darkness, reaching the first line of German wire. Miller used special cutters to snip a section, creating a passage that could be used by a larger raiding party in the future. They took measurements and made mental notes of German positions, the information more valuable than any physical objective they might capture. On the return journey, a German flare suddenly burst overhead, bathing the cratered landscape in harsh white light. Miller and his men froze instantly, becoming part of the terrain, not moving a muscle despite the mud soaking through their uniforms. The light seemed to last forever, though in reality it was less than a minute. When darkness returned, they continued their careful crawl back to British lines, successfully completing their mission without casualties. The next morning, they were relieved by fresh infantry units. The regiment assembled in the reserve area, checking equipment and preparing for the march back to their base. Despite the exhaustion and filth, there was a palpable lightening of mood. They were going back to their horses, back to being cavalrymen rather than poorly trained infantry. The march back took most of the day, men, trudging through mud with the patient endurance that had become characteristic of soldiers on all sides. They arrived at their village base as evening fell, greeted by those who had remained behind with the horses. "How's Jupiter?" was Miller's first question to Private Wilson. "Fit as a fiddle, Sergeant." The young man replied with evident pride. "Had a slight cough for a couple of days, but the vet gave him some treatment, and he's right as rain now." Miller went directly to the stables, not even stopping to clean himself up first. Jupiter greeted him with an enthusiastic nicker, pushing his nose against Miller's chest in what seemed like genuine welcome. "Miss me? Did you?" Miller smiled, the tensions of the front line beginning to ease as he checked his horse thoroughly. Jupiter seemed well, cared for, his coat gleaming from regular grooming, his muscles firm from adequate exercise. Only after satisfying himself that his horse was in good condition did Miller seek out his own comfort, a relatively hot meal in the squadron mess. A chance. to wash away 2 weeks of trench grime and a change into clean, dry clothing. That night, he slept on straw in Jupiter's stall rather than in his assigned billet. It was warmer there and somehow comforting to be back in the familiar environment of horses after the alien world of the trenches. The next week was devoted to returning to cavalry readiness, daily riding to keep both men and horses fit, weapons, training, and the constant care of equipment. Leather that had been neglected during their trench rotation needed special attention. Saddles, bridles, harnesses, all required. Cleaning and oiling to prevent cracking. Miller supervised his troop with the careful attention to detail that had become his hallmark. Equipment was inspected, riding form corrected, horse care monitored. The newer men sometimes grumbled about the seemingly endless chores, but the veterans understood their importance. A well-maintained saddle might save your life someday, Miller explained to a group of younger troopers, and it'll certainly save your horse from sores that could put him out of action when you need him most. 10 days after their return from the trenches, new orders arrived. The regiment would relocate to a position 20 miles south where intelligence suggested German forces might be thinning their lines to reinforce a push elsewhere. Reconnaissance in force, the squadron commander explained to his officers and NCOs. Division wants to know if the Germans are withdrawing or just repositioning. We'll move in, probe their defenses, and gather what information we can. This was proper cavalry work, using mobility and speed to gather intelligence. The men prepared with renewed enthusiasm, checking weapons, saddles, and equipment with extra care. Even the horses seemed to sense a change, standing more alertly. As they were groomed and saddled, they moved out at dawn, 500 horsemen riding, in formation across the winter landscape. Despite everything, the cold, the exhaustion, the knowledge that modern weapons made traditional cavalry increasingly vulnerable, there was still something magnificent about a regiment of horse soldiers on the move. Miller rode at the head of his troop, Jupiter moving with powerful strides beneath him. The gelding had recovered fully from his slight illness and seemed eager for the work, ears pricked forward, attentively. By midday, they had reached their designated area of operations. The front was quieter here with greater distance between the opposing trench systems. This created a no-man's land large enough for cavalry to maneuver, though still dangerous due to artillery and the risk of machine gun emplacements. The regiment split into squadrons, each assigned a different sector to probe. Miller's squadron moved toward a small, wooded area that offered both cover for observation and potential concealment for enemy forces. As they approached the woods, the squadron commander signaled for them to dismount. 2 troops would proceed on foot to scout the area, while the others remained with the horses, ready to provide support or move quickly if needed. Miller led his men forward carefully, using the techniques of dismounted cavalry, moving from cover to cover, maintaining visual contact without bunching together, rifles ready but not, firing unless necessary to avoid giving away their position. The woods were eerily quiet, showing signs of artillery damage, but no recent human activity. They found an abandoned German observation post hastily evacuated, judging by the equipment left behind, including a pair of high-quality binoculars that Miller pocketed for the intelligence officers. "Looks like they pulled back, Sergeant," whispered Corporal Jenkins. "No sign of occupation for at least several days." Miller nodded, continuing to scan the area carefully. "Let's complete the sweep before reporting back." They moved through the entire wooded area methodically, finding further evidence of German withdrawal. Empty ammunition, boxes, discarded ration tins are hastily filled in latrine. Everything pointed to a significant reduction in enemy presence in this sector. As they prepared to return to the waiting horses, a distant sound caught Miller's attention. the unmistakable rumble of engines. Hold, he ordered quietly, signaling his men to take cover. From their concealed position, they watched as a column of vehicles appeared on a road about half a mile away. Trucks, a few staff cars, and what appeared to be mobile artillery pieces. German reinforcements moving up, contradicting the evidence of withdrawal they had just found. They're not abandoning the sector, Miller realized. They're mechanizing it. Fewer men, more machines. This was valuable intelligence. Exactly the kind of information their reconnaissance mission was meant to gather. Miller detailed 2 men to continue observation while he led the others back to report. The squadron commander received the news with grave interest. Good work, Sergeant. This confirms reports from other sectors. The Germans are reorganizing, not retreating. By evening, all squadrons had returned from their reconnaissance tasks, bringing similar reports of reduced enemy infantry presence, but increased mechanization. The regiment consolidated this information for transmission to division headquarters, providing a crucial piece of the intelligence puzzle. As they established their night camp, Miller reflected on what they had observed. The war was continuing to evolve, with machines increasingly replacing men on both sides. Where did that leave cavalry? The oldest form of mobile warfare, now seemingly overtaken by technology. Yet their day's work had proven there was still value in mounted reconnaissance. Horses could move quickly and quietly across terrain that would bog down vehicles. They required no fuel beyond forage, made no engine noise to alert the enemy, and could access areas where mechanical transport couldn't go. Perhaps there was a future for cavalry. After all, Miller thought, as he tended to Jupiter before seeking his own rest, not in the glorious charges of old, but in the essential work of gathering intelligence, exploiting gaps, and providing mobility in a war increasingly characterized by stalemate. As he settled into his bedroll beneath a star-filled sky, the familiar sound of horses nearby provided comfort. The animals shifted and snorted occasionally, their presence a reminder of continuity amid the chaos of war. Whatever changes technology brought to battlefield, the bond between cavalrymen and their horses remained constant, a relationship built on mutual dependence and trust that no machine could replace. Tomorrow would bring new orders, new challenges, but for tonight, the regiment had performed its duty well, demonstrating that cavalry still had a role to play in this strange new form of warfare. Miller drifted towards sleep, one hand resting on his rifle. His last conscious thought, a reminder to check Jupiter's shoeing in the morning. The small details of horse care remained important even as the larger pattern of the war continued to transform around them. Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew of Lord Strathcona's horse had been in the saddle for nearly 18 hours. His thighs ached, his back was stiff, and the persistent drizzle had soaked through his greatcoat hours ago. But discomfort was the least of his concerns as he studied the German positions through his field glasses. March 1918 had brought dramatic changes to the Western Front. After years of stalemate, the Germans had launched their massive spring offensive, Operation Michael, on March 21st. Transferring divisions from the now quiet Eastern Front, following Russia's exit from the war, the Germans had amassed an enormous force for one final push to break the Allied lines before American troops could arrive in significant numbers. The initial attack had been devastating, using new infiltration tactics, specially trained stormtroops, and an overwhelming artillery barrage. German forces had torn through British defenses, advancing further in days than either side had managed in years of previous fighting. Now, on March 30th, the Canadian Cavalry Brigade found itself in the path of the German advance. While most of the Canadian Corps was deployed elsewhere, the Cavalry Brigade, consisting of Lord Strathcona's horse, the Royal Canadian Dragoons, and the Fort Garry Horse had been attached to the British 3rd Cavalry Division as a mobile reserve. Germans have occupied the wood, sir, reported Sergeant Matthews, lowering his own binoculars. Looks like they're bringing up machine guns. Flowerdew nodded grimly. Morey Wood dominated the surrounding terrain, overlooking the strategically vital Amiens-Paris Railway. If the Germans consolidated their position there, they would threaten the crucial transportation link and potentially split the British and French armies. Numbers, he asked. Hard to say exactly. At least a battalion, possibly more. They seemed to be digging in rather than continuing to advance. It was the first piece of good news in days. The German advance, while impressive, was finally showing signs of losing momentum. Their supply lines were stretched, their troops exhausted, and they had outrun much of their artillery support. If there was ever a moment for cavalry to prove its worth in this war, it was now. Flowerdew returned to the squadron's temporary position in the shallow valley where the men were tending to their horses. Despite the constant movement of the past week, the animals looked remarkably good, testament to the cavalry's devotion to horse care even in crisis. Captain Nordheimer, the squadron commander, was conferred with the other officers when Flowerdew arrived. The news wasn't good. Brigade HQ reports German forces continuing to advance toward Amiens, Nordheimer said, pointing to positions on his map. If they take and hold Morey Wood, they'll have observation over the entire valley. We've been ordered to dislodge them. A momentary silence greeted this announcement. Every man present understood what it meant. Attacking an entrenched enemy likely supported by machine guns and terrain. That limited cavalry's greatest advantage. Mobility. Do we have infantry support? Asked Lieutenant Harvey, voicing what everyone was thinking. Nordheimer shook his head. None available. Every infantry unit is committed elsewhere. It's down to us. Such was the reality of the German spring offensive. The rapid advance had created a fluid, chaotic battlefield where traditional battle lines had dissolved. Units found themselves isolated, communications disrupted, and commanders forced to make decisions with incomplete information. In this environment, cavalry had found a new relevance, able to move quickly to threaten points, plug gaps in a line, and operate independently when necessary. Brigadier General Seeley's plan is to attack from multiple directions. Nordheimer continued, referring to the commander of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade. The Royal Canadian Dragoons will assault from the north and west, will approach from the east and south. The Fort Garry Horse will remain in reserve. Initially, the officers studied the map, mentally calculating approaches, fields of fire, and potential rally points. Attacking a wood was never ideal for cavalry. Trees limited movement and provided cover for defenders, but they had little choice. We'll advance in bounds, Nordheimer decided. 2 troops mounted to maintain mobility. 2 dismounted for firepower. Lieutenant Flowerdew, your C squadron will form. Our reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough. Flowerdew nodded, accepting the assignment. C Squadron had seen heavy fighting earlier in the week, but had suffered fewer casualties than the others. They were as ready as anyone could be under the circumstances. The men received their orders with the stoic professionalism that had become characteristic of veteran troops. There was no bravado, no dramatic speeches, just a methodical preparation for what all knew would be a difficult operation. Private James McGregor tightened his saddle girth, checked his ammunition, and made sure his rifle was clean and ready. After 3 years on the Western Front, the 24-year-old former ranch hand from Saskatchewan had lost any romantic notions about cavalry warfare. He'd seen too many good men, and horses die to harbor illusions. Think this will work? He asked his section mate, a Quebecois. trooper named Belangi. The French-Canadian shrugged, adjusting his uniform tunic. Maybe. Germans look tired. We're tired, too, but at least we have horses. It was a fair assessment. Both sides were exhausted after 9 days of continuous movement and combat. The difference was that cavalry, despite everything, could still move faster than infantry, a crucial advantage in the fluid situation they now faced. At 0930 hours, the attack began. The Canadian cavalrymen advanced toward Morey Wood, in squadron formation, initially maintaining distance from the German positions to minimize casualties during the approach. From his position with the reserve squadron, Flowerdew watched as A and B squadrons moved forward. A squadron soon dismounted, leaving horse holders behind as the majority of troopers advanced on foot using fire and movement tactics that blended cavalry mobility with infantry fighting techniques. B squadron continued mounted, circling to approach the wood from the south. German rifle fire began to crackle from the treeline, causing several horses to fall, but the squadron pressed on, troopers firing their rifles from horseback, a skill that British and Commonwealth cavalry practiced regularly, unlike their French and German counterparts who primarily relied on mounted shock action. The Royal Canadian Dragoons were simultaneously attacking from the north, creating the divided attention that the brigade commander had planned. German defenders, expecting to face only infantry, found themselves confronting mounted troops, approaching rapidly from multiple directions. McGregor and Belangi remained with C Squadron, waiting tensely for the order to move. Around them, horses sensed the heightened emotions of their riders, shifting nervously and tossing their heads. The sound of gunfire was continuous now, punctuated by the distinctive chatter of machine guns. Mount up, C Squadron. The order finally came, relayed through the chain of command. We're going in. Flowerdew gathered his men quickly. We'll advance. To the northeastern corner of the wood, he instructed, be prepared to dismount, and fight on foot once we reach the trees. The squadron moved forward a trot, maintaining formation despite the increasingly dangerous fire. As they approached the wood, Flowerdew suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt, through a gap in the trees. He had spotted something alarming, a large group of German infantry deploying from the far side of the wood, preparing to counterattack the dismounted Canadians who had penetrated the forest. There was no time to consult with headquarters. If those German troops established defensive positions or launched their counterattack, the entire brigade operation could fail. A decision had to be made immediately. Draw swords, Flowerdew ordered, his voice cutting through the noise of battle. The command was unexpected. Swords had rarely been used offensively in this war, but the men responded instantly, steel blades flashing as they were pulled from scabbards. C Squadron will charge. Flowerdew pointed toward the German infantry. Form. Line. The squadron quickly transitioned from column to line formation, spreading out to maximize their frontage. Roughly 70 men on horseback, sabers drawn, facing approximately 300 German infantry with rifles and machine guns. McGregor felt his heart pounding as he took position in the line. Part of him recognized the madness of what they were about to do, but another part, the cavalrymen trained for this moment, felt an odd calm. Beside him, Belangi muttered what sounded like a prayer in French. "It's a charge, boys," Flowerdew called out, his voice steady. Lord Strathcona's horse. With that, he spurred his mount forward. The entire squadron followed. Infantry that can move 10 an hour when needed, Sergeant Matthews reminded him. That's why we're here and not sitting in reserve. The sergeant's words captured the evolving role of cavalry in the war's final year. No longer primarily shock troops charging with swords and lances, they had become highly mobile infantry, able to rapidly deploy to critical points, fight dismounted when necessary, then remount and move to the next crisis. The fighting for Riflewood was intense but brief. The Germans, like the Allies, were exhausted after more than a week of continuous operations. Their resistance, while determined, lacked the coordination and firepower of the initial offensive. By noon on April the 1st, Riflewood was secured. The Canadian cavalrymen, now functioning effectively as light infantry, had established defensive positions throughout the small forest, repulsing several German counterattacks. McGregor found himself sharing a shell, whole with Belangi and 2 other troopers. All that remained of their section after the recent fighting, they had established a small machine gun position covering a likely approach route for German troops. "Think this is the turning point?" asked one of the troopers. A former bank clerk from Toronto named Wilson feels like the Germans are running out of steam. Or maybe, McGregor replied, scanning the terrain through his field glasses, but they've still got a lot of fight left. He was right. While the momentum of the German spring offensive was indeed waning, the fighting would continue for months. The Canadian Cavalry Brigade would remain in action throughout, sometimes mounted, sometimes dismounted, always moving to where they were needed. Most, the battle for Morey Wood and Rifle would represent something significant. One of the last times in military history that cavalry would play a decisive role in a major engagement. The charge of Flowerdew Sea Squadron would be studied for decades as both a tactical success and a symbol of cavalry's last hurrah. As April progressed, the German offensive gradually lost momentum. Allied counterattacks began to recover lost ground, and the front stabilized once more, though not before the Germans had advanced nearly 40 miles in some sectors, the greatest movement on the Western Front since 1914. For men of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, the pace of operations slowly returned to something more sustainable. They remained in the line, but with more regular rotation and rest periods. The horses, pushed to their limits during the crisis, received the care and recovery time they desperately needed. McGregor found himself in a small French village about 10 miles behind the front in mid-April, part of a squadron rotating out of the line for rest and refitting. Kappa's wound was healing well, and the horse had maintained his weight despite the rigors of the campaign, a testament to McGregor's diligent care. The village had become a temporary remount depot, where fresh horses were prepared for service and wounded animals rehabilitated. The square was filled with horse lines, the surrounding buildings repurposed as stables, veterinary stations, and farrier workshops. "Your gelding's looking good," commented the veterinary officer during an inspection. "That shoulder wound could have been much worse." "He's tough," McGregor replied simply, running a hand along Kappa's neck. The bond between them had deepened through their shared experiences, creating the special relationship between horse and rider that was at the heart of cavalry service. The rest period brought other welcome changes. Hot food mailed from home, fresh uniforms to replace battle-worn gear. Men took the opportunity to wash properly for the first time in weeks, to write letters, to process what they had experienced. In the village's small estaminet, temporarily converted to an officer's and NCO's mess, discussions inevitably turned to the recent fighting and what it meant for cavalry's future. "We proved our worth at Morey," would argue the young lieutenant from the Fort Garry Horse, showed there's still a place for mounted troops on the modern battlefield, as mobile infantry perhaps countered a more senior officer, but traditional cavalry tactics. The charge worked at Morey because the Germans were caught by surprise. It won't work again. The debate reflected the larger conversation occurring throughout the cavalry world. The war had transformed mounted warfare, forcing adaptation and evolution. The cavalryman of 1918 was a hybrid, part traditional horseman, part modern soldier, equally comfortable in the saddle or a trench with sword or rifle. For the men of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, these theoretical discussions mattered less than the practical reality. They had a job to do, and they would continue doing it with the tools and training available to them. McGregor spent his evenings caring for Copper and the other horses in his section. The routine was therapeutic: grooming, checking hooves, monitoring feed, and water. In the chaos of war, these simple tasks provided continuity and purpose. One evening, as he worked a curry comb over Coppa's coat, Belangi joined him carrying a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" the Quebecois asked, holding up the paper. It contained an article about the fighting at Morey Wood, describing the cavalry charge in heroic, almost mythological terms. McGregor skimmed the article, noting the discrepancies between the writer's romantic description and his own memories of dust, noise, and fear. "Not exactly how it happened," he commented, returning to his grooming. "No," Belangi agreed, "but maybe that's how. They need to remember it." There was wisdom in the observation, as the war entered what would prove to be its final year. Perhaps people needed to believe in moments of traditional heroism amidst the industrial slaughter. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. Under cover of this barrage, infantry and tanks began advancing through the morning mist towards the German lines. The Canadian Cavalry Brigade, along with other mounted units, waited in reserve. Their role would come later if and when the infantry secure a breakthrough. For now they maintained position, horses growing increasingly nervous under the artillery's continuous roar. "Easy, boy," McGregor murmured to Copper, stroking the gelding's neck. "Not our turn yet." The first reports began filtering back within hours. The attack was succeeding, beyond expectations. German defenses thinned by months of casualties and low morale were collapsing in many sectors. Allied tanks operating in unprecedented numbers were punching holes through enemy lines. Infantry was advancing steadily, bypassing strong points rather than becoming bogged down and costly. Frontal assaults. By mid-morning the order came: cavalry forward. The brigade moved out in column formation, passing through gaps created by the advancing infantry and tanks. As they rode, McGregor witnessed scenes unlike anything he had seen since the war's early days. A battlefield in fluid motion rather than frozen in trench. Lines, columns of prisoners streamed rearward. Hundreds and thousands of German soldiers, many looking relieved that their war was over. Allied artillery moved forward to new positions, horses straining to pull the heavy guns through churned earth. Supply vehicles, ambulances, and staff cars created congestion on the few intact roads, while across the fields, infantry continued to advance. The Canadian Cavalry Brigade pushed forward, maintaining formation despite the challenging terrain. Their objective was ambitious: to reach the old Amiens outer defense line, which would represent an advance of nearly 8 miles in a single day. As they rode, the signs of breakthrough became increasingly evident. Abandoned German positions, hastily discarded equipment, field kitchens with food still cooking, all indicated an enemy in retreat rather than conducting an orderly withdrawal. By early afternoon, they encountered their first significant resistance. A German rear guard position anchored on a small village with machine guns covering the approaches. The brigade commander quickly assessed the situation and issued orders. Lord Strathcona's horse will dismount and suppress enemy fire from the north. Royal Canadian Dragoons will circle south and cut off their retreat. Fort Garry Horse remains in reserve. McGregor and his squadron dismounted, leaving one man in four to hold the horses. With rifles in hand, they advanced in open order, using folds in the terrain for cover. It was a tactic they had practiced countless times. The fluid transition from mounted to dismounted action that defined modern cavalry. The German resistance was determined but brief, caught between dismounted Canadian cavalry on one side and mounted troops threatening their escape route on the other. The rear guard surrendered after less than an hour of fighting. "That's how it's done," Sergeant Matthews said with satisfaction as they rounded up prisoners. Mobility and firepower together, the brigade pushed on, continuing their advance through the afternoon. They passed through areas untouched by war for years. Farms with standing crops, orchards heavy with summer fruit, villages that had been behind German lines since 1914. It was a strange experience after so long in the devastated landscape of the front. By evening they had reached their objective, having advanced nearly 8 miles from their starting position, the deepest penetration of German lines since trench warfare began. The day would later be described by German General Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German Army, the beginning of the end for their hopes of victory. As darkness fell, the Canadian Cavalry Brigade established a defensive perimeter, prepared for potential counterattacks. That never materialized. The Germans were retreating all along the front, their forces disorganized and morale crumbling. McGregor tended to copper with special care that night. The horse had performed admirably throughout the long day and now deserved rest and attention. Around them, other cavalrymen did the same, the evening ritual of horse care continuing, despite the historic nature of the day's events. "We might actually win this thing," Belangi said as they shared rations beside a small fire. "Not just a battle, the war." McGregor nodded, allowing himself to consider the possibility for perhaps the first time. Might at that, the success of the Battle of Amiens marked the beginning of what would become known as the 100 Days Offensive, the final Allied push that would eventually end the war. For cavalry, it brought a return to the mobile operations they had trained for, though in a form different from pre-war expectations. Throughout August and September, the Canadian Cavalry Brigade remained actively engaged as the Allied advance continued. They performed reconnaissance, pursued retreating enemy forces, secured objectives ahead of the infantry, and occasionally engaged in direct combat when necessary. There were no more dramatic charges like Morey Wood. Both sides had learned, too, much about the devastating effect of machine guns on mounted troops. The psychological impact of seeing Allied cavalry operating freely behind what had once been secured German territory further damaged enemy morale. On September 28th, McGregor found himself in a position he could scarcely have imagined a year earlier, riding through a Belgian village that had just been liberated after 4 years of German occupation. The reception was emotional. Civilians emerging from homes to cheer the passing cavalrymen, offering water, food, and flowers. "Merci, merci," called an elderly woman, pressing a small loaf of bread into McGregor's hand as he rode past. Such moments provided powerful reminders of why they were fighting, not for territory or strategic advantage, but for people who had endured years of occupation. The brigade pushed on, maintaining the advance despite increasingly difficult autumn weather. Rain turned roads to mud. Fields became quagmires, and both men and horses suffered in the cold, wet conditions. Yet they continued forward, part of the relentless Allied pressure that was gradually forcing Germany toward acceptance of defeat. By mid-October, Signs of the war's approaching end were increasingly evident. German forces continued to retreat, though still fighting rearguard actions. Political upheaval within. Germany weakened support for continuing the conflict, and peace feelers were being extended through diplomatic channels. For the men of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, however, the war remained very real. They continued operations throughout October, their tasks evolving as the front moved eastward. Increasingly, they found themselves serving as advance guards of the infantry, moving ahead to secure crossroads, bridges, and other key terrain features. On October 20th, McGregor's squadron was assigned to secure a crossing over a small river ahead of the advancing infantry. They approached cautiously, aware that such obvious choke points were often defended. Their caution proved warranted as the lead elements neared the bridge. German machine guns opened fire from prepared positions on the far bank. Several horses and riders fell in the initial burst, while others sought cover in a drainage ditch beside the road. Dismount and suppress, ordered the squadron commander. First troop work around to the north. See if there's another crossing point. McGregor slid from the saddle, sending Copper rearward with the horse holders while he took position with his rifle. The familiar weight of the Lee Enfield was reassuring as he settled into a firing stance and began placing careful shots toward the German positions. For the next hour, a firefight raged across the river. The Canadian cavalrymen, well trained in dismounted action, gradually gained fire superiority, forcing the German gunners to keep their heads down. Meanwhile, the flanking troop located a fordable section upstream and crossed, threatening the defenders from behind. Faced with encirclement, the German force withdrew, leaving the bridge intact. By evening, Canadian infantry had arrived to secure the position permanently, allowing the cavalry to withdraw for rest and refitting. It had been a typical action for cavalry in the war's final phase, using mobility to reach a critical point quickly, fighting dismounted when necessary, then returning to horses for the next mission. The days of mass cavalry charges were gone, but the value of mounted troops for specific missions remained clear. As October turned to November, the end seemed increasingly near. The other Central Powers, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria had already signed armistices. Germany stood alone, its military situation deteriorating daily, its civilian population suffering from the Allied blockade, and its government facing revolution at home. For the men of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, the final days brought continued advance through Belgium, pushing German forces back toward their own borders. The fighting had decreased in intensity but remained dangerous. No one wanted to be the last casualty of a war clearly approaching its end. On November 10th, McGregor's squadron established bivouac in a small Belgian town that had been liberated just days earlier. The weather had turned cold, with frost coating the ground each morning and rumors of early snow in the forecast. That evening, as he completed the daily ritual of caring for Copper, McGregor noticed an unusual level of activity around the squadron headquarters. Officers were coming and going, dispatches arriving by motorcycle courier, and an air of suppressed excitement pervading the camp. "Something's happening," Belangi observed, joining McGregor at the horse lines. Before either man could speculate further, Sergeant Matthews approached, his expression uncharacteristically animated. Word from headquarters, he announced, "Germany has agreed to terms, and armistice will take effect at 11 tomorrow morning." The news spread to the camp like wildfire, met with reactions ranging from jubilation to stunned disbelief. After more than 4 years of continuous warfare, the concept of peace seemed almost unimaginable. That night, few men slept. They gathered in small groups, talking quietly, sharing memories of fallen comrades, speculating about what peace might bring. Some wrote letters home, attempting to put into words the complex emotions of the moment. McGregor spent extra time with Copper, grooming the horse long after necessity required it. The repetitive motion was soothing, helping to process thoughts too jumbled. For clear articulation, we made it. Oh boy, he murmured to the gelding. Not everyone did, but we did. Dawn on November 11th broke clear and cold, the sky a pale blue rarely seen in the often overcast Belgian autumn. The squadron prepared for the day as usual. Horses fed and watered, equipment checked, patrols organized until the armistice took effect at 11 a.m. The war continued, and they would maintain readiness. McGregor rode with a small patrol that morning, scouting roads to the east, where German forces were reportedly withdrawing. The countryside was eerily quiet, with little evidence of the enemy that had occupied this territory for years. At precisely 11 a.m., the patrol stopped. Their watches confirmed what history would record. This was the moment the Great War officially ended. No dramatic ceasefire occurred in their sector. There had been no fighting that morning to cease. Instead, there was simply a profound stillness, broken only by the sound of distant church bells beginning to ring in liberated towns and villages. "That's it then," said the patrol leader, a young lieutenant who had joined the regiment in 1917. "It's over." The words seemed inadequate to the magnitude of the moment. Yet what else could be said? After 51 months of unprecedented slaughter, after the deaths of millions and the suffering of millions more, after the transformation of warfare and the redrawing of maps, it had simply ended. The patrol returned to find the squadron in a state of subdued celebration. There were no wild displays of emotion. These were men who had seen too much for that, but there was a palpable sense of relief, of pressure, finally released after years of constant tension. In the days that followed, the reality of peace gradually settled in. The Canadian Cavalry Brigade, like other units, received orders to hold position rather than continue advancing. The fighting was over, but military occupation of former German territory would continue until formal peace treaties were signed. For cavalry, the post-war period brought immediate practical challenges. Horses required the same care in peace as in war: feeding, grooming, exercise, veterinary attention. But now these activities took place in a changed context, with the urgent pressure of combat operations removed. As November progressed, thoughts increasingly turned to home. When would they return to Canada? What would await them there? How would they adjust to civilian life after years of war? For some, there was also uncertainty about the fate of their horses. Military regulations allowed officers to purchase their mounts, but for other ranks, the future of their equine partners remained unclear. Would the animals be shipped back to Canada, sold locally, transferred to other military units? McGregor found himself increasingly concerned about Coppa's fate. The bond between them had deepened through shared danger and daily care until it transcended the simple relationship of soldier and equipment. The horse was a comrade, a partner who had carried him through some of the most significant experiences of his life. In early December, the squadron commander called McGregor to his temporary office in a requisitioned Belgian home. "Private McGregor," the officer began, "I understand you've been inquiring about purchasing your mount." "Yes, sir," McGregor replied. "If that's possible." The commander studied him thoughtfully. "Officially, only officers have that privilege." However, he paused, shuffling papers on his desk. "There are provisions for recognition of exceptional service. Your record with the regiment has been exemplary." He pushed the document across the desk. "This authorizes a transfer of ownership of Cavalry Mount C-227. Copper to you at a nominal fee. Consider it recognition for your service." McGregor stared at the paper, momentarily speechless. "Thank you, sir. I thank you." The commander nodded, a small smile breaking through his usual reserve. Take good care of him. He's earned a peaceful retirement. Not all cavalrymen were so fortunate. Many horses were indeed sold locally or transferred to other units rather than making the long journey back to Canada. For some men, saying goodbye to animals they had cared for daily was one of the war's final heartbreaks. As 1918 drew to a close, the Canadian Cavalry Brigade began the process of demobilization. It would be months before all troops returned home with occupation duties and administrative requirements, delaying their departure from Europe. During this period of waiting, the men had time to reflect on their experiences and the changing nature of warfare they had witnessed. Conversations often turned to the future of cavalry in light of the war's lessons. Tanks will replace us eventually, predicted a sergeant. During an evening discussion in late December, more firepower, more protection. Maybe, Belangi countered. But they break down, get stuck in mud, can't go everywhere a horse can. It'll be a mix, offered Sergeant Matthews, drawing on his pipe. Horses for some jobs, machines for others, at least for a while. History would prove him partially right. While the era of horse cavalry was indeed approaching its end, mounted troops would continue to serve in various capacities through the interwar years and even into World War II. But the large-scale mounted operations that had defined cavalry for centuries would never return. For McGregor, such abstract discussions mattered less than the practical reality of his future with copper. Arrangements had been made to transport the horse back to Canada along with McGregor's unit, an unusual concession that reflected both the squadron commander's influence and recognition of exemplary service. In January 1919, as preparations for their return journey were finalized, McGregor took Copper for a long ride to the Belgian countryside. The winter landscape was starkly beautiful. Bare trees etched against gray skies, fields resting under a light dusting of snow. They rode past villages still, showing the scars of war, but beginning the process of rebuilding. Farmers were already preparing for spring planting, determined to restore productivity to land that had seen only destruction for years. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with the memories of the past 4 years. The noise, the fear, the constant presence of death. The transition from war to peace would take time, not just for damaged landscapes, but for the men who had fought across them. As they crested a small hill, McGregor halted, looking back over the terrain they had traversed. From this vantage point, he could see for miles rolling farmland, small villages with church spires, and in the far distance, the faint outline of a city. It struck him that this view, the ability to see and understand the larger landscape, represented one of cavalry's enduring contributions to the war effort. Even as technology had changed the nature of combat, mounted troops had provided essential mobility and situational awareness in a conflict often characterized by confusion and limited visibility. At Morey Wood, at Rifle Wood, during the 100 Days Offensive and countless smaller actions, cavalry had used its inherent mobility to reach critical points, quickly, to gather intelligence, to exploit opportunities. They had adapted to the realities of modern warfare, while maintaining the traditional strengths of mounted troops. McGregor patted Coppa's neck, feeling the strong muscles beneath his hand. "We did our part, didn't we, boy?" The horse nickered softly in response, perhaps sensing his rider's reflective mood. For a moment they remained motionless on the hilltop, silhouetted against the winter sky. Man and horse, representatives of a military tradition reaching back thousands of years, now standing at the threshold of a new era. In February 1919, McGregor, Copper, and the rest of their unit finally departed for Canada. The journey was long, first by train to a channel port, then by ship across the Atlantic, and finally by train again to their destination in Saskatchewan. Throughout the voyage, McGregor maintained his routine of daily care for Copper, ensuring the horse weathered the journey in good condition. Other surviving cavalry mounts travel with them, destined for farms, ranches, and, in some cases, continued service with Canadian mounted police units. When they finally arrived home in early March, a small ceremony marked the regiment's return. Families gathered to welcome loved ones who had been away for years. There were tears, embraces, moments of joy tinged with the awareness of those who would never return. McGregor's parents met him at the station, his father proudly wearing his own medals from earlier service. They had arranged for transportation of Copper to their small farm, where the horse would live out his days in peace, a living reminder of their son's service and the bond forged in war. As spring arrived, bringing new growth to the Saskatchewan prairie, McGregor began the process of reintegration into civilian life. The transition was not always easy. Nightmares sometimes disturbed his sleep, bringing back memories of artillery barges and machine gun fire. Certain sounds, a car backfiring thunder during a storm, could trigger momentary returns to combat alertness. But there were also elements that eased the adjustment. Daily work on the farm provided structure and purpose. Family offered support and understanding, and Copper's presence gave continuity, a living connection to experiences that often seemed increasingly distant and dreamlike. On pleasant evenings, McGregor would sometimes ride across the family's land, Copper moving with the smooth gait that had carried him through years of war. These quiet rides became a form of therapy, a way of processing memories, and gradually reconciling the soldier he had been with the civilian he was becoming. During one such ride in late April, he encountered Belangi, who had settled on neighboring land after receiving a veteran's land grant. The Quebecois had also managed to bring his mare home, and the two former cavalrymen often rode together, sharing memories and observations that civilians couldn't fully understand saw in the newspaper. That Flowerdew got the Victoria Cross, Belangi mentioned as they rode side by side across a rolling meadow posthumous, of course. McGregor nodded. Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew's leadership during the charge at Morey Wood had indeed been recognized with Britain's highest military honor. Acknowledging his courage and the tactical importance of that action deserved it, McGregor replied simply, "Change the course of that whole battle." They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in memories of that day. The thunder of hooves, the chaos of combat, the strange mixture of fear and exhilaration that accompanied cavalry in action. Think anyone will remember? Belangi asked eventually. What cavalry did I mean? Or will they just talk about tanks and planes? It was a question that touched on larger concerns. How the war would be remembered, how history would judge their contribution, whether the sacrifices had been worthwhile. Some will remember. McGregor said after consideration, maybe not everyone, but enough. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, the two former cavalrymen turned their horses toward home. They rode at an easy trot, man and horse, moving together, with the synchronicity born of years together in peace and war. In that moment, riding across the Saskatchewan landscape, so different from the battlefields of France and Belgium, McGregor felt a sense of connection that transcended time and place. He was part of a lineage stretching back through centuries, men who had ridden to war, who had experienced the unique bond between soldier and horse, who had adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining essential traditions. Cavalry had survived the First World War, though transformed by the experience. It had proven its continued value even in an age of machine guns, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The lessons learned about mobility, flexibility, the combination of mounted and dismounted action would influence future military thinking for decades to come.